He came to school with a shabby cello, old sneakers, and complete silence. They didn't put him on stage for talent, they put him on stage for humiliation. But when he struck the strings with his bow, the entire auditorium froze. Teachers, classmates, even the principal, no one expected to hear that. Subscribe to the channel and tell me where you're watching from. The cracked paint on the window frame peeled away in the summer heat as a single beam of sunlight slid through the narrow kitchen of a third-floor apartment in the South End projects. It landed on the chipped linoleum floor and traced its way up to the boy seated at the table, his back straight, his dark fingers folded neatly in his lap. His name was Jalen, 13 years old, eyes too solemn for his age. His wiry frame was dressed in a faded blue t-shirt and fraying jeans, the soles of his sneakers curling at the edges. Across from him, his grandmother stirred a pot of grits on the stove. The aroma of butter and salt filled the cramped space, but neither of them spoke. She moved slowly, with the measured care of someone who knew how to stretch every ounce of strength. A scarf covered her graying hair, and the lines on her face bore silent testimony to years of hard choices and quiet endurance. On the table beside Jalen sat a beat-up cello case, worn soft at the edges like an overused Bible. The latch had long since broken, replaced with a shoelace tied in a double knot. Jalen had been up since before dawn, as he always was. The summer mornings were the only time he could practice without interruption. His apartment building was filled with early risers, babies crying, dogs barking, and the occasional police siren screaming through the streets, but none of it interrupted his concentration. He played in the hallway sometimes, near the radiator where the acoustics were just right. Other times he played on the roof, the city sprawling out beneath him like a living, groaning thing. The cello hadn't always been his. His mother, a music teacher before her illness, had rescued it from a burned-out art school downtown. It was already damaged then, its back cracked, strings missing, but she fixed it up, painted the wood with careful hands, and placed it in Jalen's lap when he was 8 years old. "It'll speak for you," she'd said, the tremor in her voice barely noticeable then, "when the world won't listen to your words." That cello had outlived her. He'd kept playing, even after she was gone. Especially after. When his grandmother cried at night behind the bedroom door, he played soft lullabies. When his classmates mocked him at school, he played until his fingers ached. He didn't read music the way others did. Everything he played, he learned by ear or felt in his bones. That morning, a letter had arrived. It was folded and creased with a school seal embossed at the top. Riverview Academy, it read, printed in an elegant serif font with too much space between the lines, as if the words themselves looked down on whoever read them. Jalen's name was there, right beneath accepted with full scholarship. His grandmother had wept. Not soft, dignified tears, but sobs, the kind that pulled from somewhere deep in the chest. She hugged him and kissed his forehead and said, "Your mama would have been so proud." But Jalen didn't feel proud. He felt nervous. Riverview Academy was not the kind of place for boys like him. He knew that before he even saw it. He'd heard the whispers from other kids in the neighborhood about the gold-trimmed gates, the classrooms with heated floors, the students who wore custom uniforms and carried tablets instead of books. It was a place where power dressed itself in old money and polished shoes, where kids came with last names that opened doors and daddies with law firms. Still, he went. On the first day of school, Jalen woke before the sun. He dressed in the uniform sent to him by the scholarship office, a size too large, the fabric stiff and unfamiliar. He slicked his hair back, packed his lunch in a brown paper bag, and carried his cello case with both hands. His grandmother kissed his forehead again and whispered a prayer into his ear. Then he boarded the bus alone. The ride to Riverview felt like crossing into another world. The city faded, replaced by wide streets, manicured lawns, and houses with gates taller than people. When the bus finally pulled up to the school, Jalen stared through the window, unable to move. The building was enormous, built of old stone, its windows glinting like watchful eyes. Marble pillars lined the front entrance. Students poured in from sleek cars and town cars, their shoes shined, their hair perfect. He stepped off the bus, and the weight of every eye on the campus seemed to fall directly on his shoulders. Some looked at him with curiosity, others with disdain, and many didn't bother hiding either. Inside, the halls were quieter than he expected. The floors were so clean they reflected the ceiling lights. Paintings of old headmasters lined the walls, all of them white, all of them frowning. Jalen walked slowly, his cello case banging lightly against his knee with each step. He stopped at a glass display that held trophies and photos of past graduating classes. No one in those pictures looked like him. He found his homeroom and entered just as the bell rang. A hush fell over the room. Students turned to look at him, some raising their eyebrows, others snickering under their breath. A girl in the front row whispered something to her neighbor, who stifled a laugh. Jalen kept his head down and took the only open seat in the back. "Name?" the teacher asked without looking up from her attendance sheet. "Jalen Thomas," he said. She paused, marked something on the paper, and continued. She did not smile. The day passed in a blur of lectures, introductions, and stares. At lunch, he ate alone at the end of the courtyard bench, unwrapping his peanut butter sandwich while groups around him chatted about ski trips and private tutors. He heard his name whispered once, twice, then a third time, followed by laughter. In his last period of the day, music theory, he met Mr. Shelby. Tall, gray-haired, and impeccably dressed in a tailored vest, Mr. Shelby stood at the front of the class like a man giving a sermon. He spoke of Bach and Tchaikovsky, of form and function, of the elegance of structure. His voice was clear and commanding, his words soaked in condescension. At the end of the lecture, Mr. Shelby asked if anyone in the class had prior musical experience. A few hands rose. Violin, piano, flute. Jalen hesitated but raised his hand too. Shelby's gaze landed on him with mild surprise. "Yes, Mr. Thomas." "I play the cello," Jalen said quietly. The teacher smiled, not kindly, but with a spark of mischief. "Wonderful," he said. "Then we shall hear you at the assembly next week. You'll open our fall showcase." The room burst into murmurs. "But I haven't," Jalen began. Shelby waved a hand dismissively. "No need to be modest. I'm sure the school will appreciate your unique perspective." Jalen sat back, stunned. He hadn't signed up for this. He hadn't even agreed. And yet, there it was. Decided, confirmed, final. The bell rang and the students rushed out, some laughing, some shaking their heads. One boy, tall and broad-shouldered, brushed past Jalen and muttered, "This'll be good." That night, Jalen barely touched his dinner. His grandmother noticed, but she didn't press him. He sat by the window after washing the dishes, his cello across his lap. He didn't play. He just stared at it, his fingers resting on the strings. He was no longer sure the world would ever listen to what he had to say. But somewhere deep in his chest, just beneath the ache of doubt, something flickered. Not hope, not yet, but maybe the first breath of defiance. The next morning, the city seemed grayer than usual. Rain hadn't yet come, but the air was thick with its promise. Jalen moved through the motions of breakfast in silence, barely registering the soft gospel humming from the radio or the clink of his grandmother's spoon against the edge of her teacup. The memory of Mr. Shelby's announcement haunted him like a shadow, too stubborn to leave even in the sun. He had tried, for a brief second, to convince himself it wasn't real, that the showcase invitation had been a misunderstanding or a passing comment made to entertain the room. But as soon as he entered the music wing, the looks he received from other students confirmed what he already knew. The trap had been set, and he had walked right into it. The showcase was a well-established tradition at Riverview Academy. A formal assembly held each fall in the grand auditorium, where students showcased their musical, theatrical, or artistic talents before an audience of faculty, parents, alumni, and donors. For most students, it was an opportunity to impress the kinds of people who could change lives with a signature or a phone call. For Jalen, it was a stage he'd never asked to stand on, with lights aimed not to honor, but to expose. That day, during music class, Mr. Shelby pulled Jalen aside after the bell rang. The other students filed out, some casting glances over their shoulders, smirking with anticipation. The room smelled of varnished wood and brass polish, its shelves lined with pristine instruments, each in perfect condition and likely worth more than Jalen's entire apartment. "I've reserved a school cello for you," Mr. Shelby said without preamble, walking across the room to a tall storage cabinet. "You'll be using this for the showcase." He pulled out a sleek black hard case and laid it carefully on a table. Jalen stepped closer, hesitant. When the case was opened, his breath caught for a moment. It was a fine-looking instrument. The wood gleamed under the lights, the strings perfectly aligned. But when he reached out and plucked one, the pitch was sour, warped. Another string felt loose. He ran his fingers gently over the body and saw it. A long, thin crack running down the back. Barely visible, but unmistakable to someone who knew how to look. Jalen glanced at Mr. Shelby, whose expression remained unreadable. "It's seen some use," the teacher said, almost too casually, "but I'm sure you'll manage." He wanted to ask for a different instrument, but he could already hear the implied consequences. This wasn't a suggestion. It was a test wrapped in an insult. He nodded quietly, took the cello, and walked out of the room as Mr. Shelby's voice floated behind him. "I look forward to hearing you rehearse tomorrow." That evening, Jalen sat at the kitchen table, the broken school cello resting beside him, and stared at it like it was a loaded weapon. His own cello, old and splintered but familiar, leaned against the wall in the corner. His grandmother noticed the look on his face and stopped chopping onions. "What's wrong with it?" she asked softly. Jalen hesitated. He didn't want to worry her. "It's not mine," he finally said. "It doesn't sound right." "You play it like you do yours, and it will," she said, though she clearly didn't understand the weight of what he was carrying. He nodded anyway and went to his room, closing the door behind him. That night, he didn't touch the school cello. Instead, he pulled his own from its soft cloth cradle, sat on the floor, and began to play. The notes came slowly at first, rough and uncertain, but as he settled into the music, they grew bolder. He didn't play Bach or Brahms or any of the pieces Mr. Shelby would expect. He played something of his own, a melody that had no name, built from memory and silence and the faint heartbeat of longing that lived in his chest. It was a lament and a protest all at once, and when he was done, the room felt both emptier and more full than before. The next few days unfolded like a silent countdown. Word of his performance had spread beyond the music department. In the lunchroom, whispers followed him. "He's gonna bomb," someone said too loudly. Another student pretended to play an invisible cello and mock cried. Even teachers began treating him differently, some with forced politeness, others with thinly veiled skepticism. He was assigned no formal rehearsal space. The music rooms were suddenly booked or under maintenance whenever he tried to sign up. Left with no other option, he began practicing in an old maintenance closet near the gym, the only space that didn't smell like bleach or mildew. The acoustics were terrible, but it was quiet. He practiced in the dark with a single light bulb above him, the cracked school cello whining under his fingers like it didn't want to be played. Still, he persisted. Each night, he returned home exhausted, the strain of holding in his frustration heavier than any physical weight. He began waking up in the middle of the night, fingers twitching, mind replaying the coming performance like a nightmare on a loop. His grandmother grew concerned, but he smiled through her questions. "Just nerves," he'd say. "I'm fine." He wasn't. He could feel something closing in around him, not just the humiliation that had been planned, but something deeper, something institutional. He was being positioned, piece by piece, into a narrative he hadn't written. He was to be the punchline to a private joke, the cautionary tale about why boys like him didn't belong in places like Riverview. It wasn't just about music. It never was. 3 days before the showcase, he made a decision. He would not play the school cello. He would not stumble through a performance designed to break him. Instead, he would play his own music, on his own instrument. And he would play it not for them, but for his mother, for his grandmother, for himself. He stayed up late into the night, writing a new piece in his head. No sheet music, no formal structure, just feeling. It would begin softly, like the way his mother used to sing to him as a baby. Then it would build, layer after layer, until it became something too big to ignore. It would tell his story without words, and they would have no choice but to listen. The night before the performance, he polished his cello until it glowed. He tightened the strings, tuned them by ear, and tested every note until they rang true. Then he sat cross-legged on the floor and played the full piece from start to finish, once, twice, 3 times, until the tremble in his fingers disappeared. His grandmother watched from the doorway, tears in her eyes. She didn't say anything until he finished. "You ready?" she asked. Jalen looked up, and for the first time in days, he nodded with certainty. "Yes, ma'am." He wasn't ready because he wanted to be. He was ready because he had to be, because dignity had a sound, and he would make sure they heard it. The morning of the showcase arrived cloaked in silence. The city outside still held its breath, the sky pale with a hint of cloud that promised neither rain nor light. In the dim apartment kitchen, Jalen sat at the table with his hands wrapped around a mug of lukewarm tea. His grandmother had risen earlier than usual, bustling about with the quiet nervousness of someone who wanted to be useful but didn't know how. She'd ironed his shirt twice, brushed imaginary lint from his slacks, and set out his cello beside the door like a soldier's weapon before battle. Jalen hadn't slept much. He had lain awake listening to the city stir, car horns in the distance, someone yelling on the corner, the clatter of trash bins in the alley, but his mind was elsewhere. In the quiet moments before dawn, he had played the melody in his head over and over again, as if by repetition alone he could chase the doubt away. Now, as he sat in his 2 clean clothes, the polished wood of his cello case reflecting the soft kitchen light, he felt a strange calm settle over him. Not peace, exactly. more like a resolve that had hardened in the fire of sleepless nights and whispered mockery. The ride to Riverview Academy felt longer than usual. The bus seats were stiff beneath him, the other students unusually quiet, as though they too were bracing for something. Most of them were excited. Their performances had been rehearsed under the careful guidance of private tutors and supportive parents. They wore designer shoes, carried instruments in pristine leather cases, and chatted about which conservatory scouts might be in the audience. Jalen sat alone at the back, clutching his cello case with both hands, the weight of it pressing into his knees like a reminder of everything he carried. When they arrived, the school was already transformed. White and gold banners hung from the stone archways, and potted chrysanthemums lined the walkway to the auditorium. Inside, the air buzzed with the low hum of excitement and the scent of freshly polished wood. The stage lights had been tested, the microphones arranged, and rows upon rows of chairs waited to be filled by parents in expensive coats and school board members with folded arms. Backstage, the mood was thick with expectation. Students adjusted their ties and tuned their instruments, their voices hushed but tense. Jalen stood near the edge of the curtain, staring at the polished Steinway grand piano in the center of the stage. It gleamed like an altar, every inch of it flawless and foreign. His cello looked small beside it, humble. He caught a glimpse of his reflection in its lacquered side, nervous, too thin, too out of place, and quickly looked away. Miss Grace, a younger teacher from the English department who had always treated him kindly, approached him with a soft smile. She placed a hand gently on his shoulder. "You've got this," she whispered. Her voice was warm, but her eyes held worry. Jalen nodded, his throat too tight for words. Then Mr. Shelby appeared, clipboard in hand, his voice ringing out over the chatter like a gavel. "Places, everyone. We're starting in 5. He turned to the curtain and stepped through it onto the stage. The murmur of the audience quieted. Jalen could see him from the wings, standing beneath the lights in his crisp vest and silver tie, his smile wide but sharp. "Ladies and gentlemen," Shelby began, "welcome to Riverview Academy's annual Fall Showcase. Tonight, you'll witness the extraordinary talents of our student body, artists, musicians, and performers whose dedication and excellence represent the very best of what we cultivate here at Riverview." There was a smattering of applause, polite and restrained. "To begin our program," Shelby continued, his tone shifting ever so slightly, "we have something unconventional. A new student, recently admitted through our scholarship initiative, will be gracing us with his take on classical music." Laughter stirred softly in the audience, just a few chuckles, but enough to make Jalen's stomach clench. Shelby paused theatrically, then said, "Please welcome Jalen Thomas." The applause that followed was uneven. Some parents clapped politely. Others seemed confused. One woman in the front row barely lifted her hands from her lap. Jalen stepped onto the stage slowly, the weight of his cello balanced against his side, the soles of his shoes making the softest sound against the wooden floor. The lights blinded him. For a moment, he could see nothing but vague outlines, rows of suited figures, flickers of gold jewelry, the glint of camera phones raised not to honor, but to document a failure. He sat down. The chair creaked beneath him, but he didn't flinch. He placed the cello between his knees, adjusted the end pin, and positioned his fingers. His hands were trembling. He closed his eyes. And then he remembered his mother's voice, not in song, but in warning, once spoken long ago. "When they try to make you feel small, son, play like you're the biggest thing in the room." He took a breath, then another. The first note was barely audible, a whisper of sound like the first words of a prayer. The audience leaned in, unsure if he had even begun. Then came the second note, drawn out, long and steady. A hush fell over the auditorium. The melody emerged slowly, building from the bottom like something crawling toward the surface after years of silence. It wasn't a piece anyone had heard before. It had no name. It wasn't written in any book, but it had shape and sorrow and purpose. It spoke of late nights and forgotten buildings, of grief too deep for tears, of hope that refused to die. As the note swelled, Jalen's posture changed. He no longer looked like a boy afraid. He moved with conviction, eyes shut, body swaying with the music. His fingers danced along the strings with a fluency that seemed impossible for someone without formal training. The cello sang, not prettily, but truthfully. Each phrase was deliberate, every pause heavy with meaning. The room held its breath. Even the skeptics began to shift in their seats. Phones were lowered. Whispers ceased. Some audience members leaned forward, brows furrowed, lips parted. They were listening, not to a scholarship student or a curiosity, but to a musician. Behind the curtain, several students and teachers had gathered to watch. Miss Grace clutched her hands to her chest. The headmaster, seated in the front row beside Shelby, turned his head slightly, as if suddenly uncertain of the narrative they had prepared. Jalen's piece moved through phases: grief, defiance, longing, and finally, peace. When the last note faded into silence, it did not vanish quickly. It lingered in the air, a phantom echo that refused to leave. No one clapped. Not immediately. The audience sat frozen, stunned by what they had just witnessed. Then, from the far left of the first row, a woman rose. She was in her 60s, her silver hair pulled into a bun, and she began to applaud. Slowly, deliberately, one clap after another. Then another person joined. Then 2 more. And then, as if something had snapped, the entire auditorium rose in unison. The applause thundered. Some people whistled, others cheered. A few had tears in their eyes. Jalen remained seated, breath shallow, hands still trembling. He looked out into the crowd and found her, his grandmother, seated in the far right corner, her back straight, her eyes shining, her hands pressed together over her heart. She didn't clap. She just smiled, proud and whole. When Jalen stood, the ovation swelled even louder. He bowed once, simply, and walked off the stage without a word. The cello case, waiting in the wings, felt lighter now, though nothing about the day had been easy. Backstage, a few students moved aside to let him pass. No one mocked him. Some looked away, ashamed. Others nodded faintly, eyes wide. He found a quiet corner and sat, placing the cello beside him. His heart still raced, but the fear had burned away. In its place was something steadier. Not triumph, not relief. It was dignity. He had played, not for their approval, not for their validation, but for his mother, for himself, for every note he had ever pulled from wood and string in the dark. And this time, they had listened. The weekend after the showcase moved like a strange, quiet tide through Riverview Academy. The campus itself remained unchanged. The manicured hedges, the glossy hallways, the red brick gleaming in the crisp autumn sun. But something beneath its polished surface had shifted. A current hummed invisibly through the marble floors and vaulted corridors, charging each footstep, each whisper, with something unspoken, yet undeniably real. Jalen noticed the difference immediately. On Monday morning, as he walked through the main gates, there were no jeers, no smirking glances from passing students. A few looked at him, truly looked, then glanced away, almost guilty. Others offered the briefest nods, awkward and unfamiliar, as though unsure of how to greet someone they'd once dismissed. But it was not until he entered the cafeteria that he understood the full extent of what had happened. Conversations hushed when he passed by. A few students nudged their neighbors and tilted their phones discreetly toward him. Some watched him openly, not with cruelty, but curiosity. And above all else, there was a new kind of silence, the kind that comes not from rejection, but from awe. He could feel it crawling along the edges of the room like light before a storm. He found his usual table near the windows and sat alone, his lunch untouched. Within minutes, Miss Grace appeared, her expression unreadable, and slid into the seat across from him. She set her tablet on the table and turned it toward him. The video played without sound. It was shaky, filmed from the third row of the auditorium. The angle caught only a part of his performance, the bow moving across the strings, the glow of the stage lights on his face, the bowed curve of his back. But it was enough. Enough to feel the weight of the silence that had held the room. Enough to hear the ache in each note. Enough to see what the audience had seen. That something extraordinary had happened on that stage. Below the video was a view count. 800,000. Jalen's eyes widened, his breath hitched. It started spreading that night, Miss Grace said quietly. Someone posted it to their story, and it just caught fire. A few arts pages picked it up, then a music blog, then the school board's account. It's everywhere now. Jalen blinked at the screen, trying to absorb what it meant. He had no social media. He didn't know what going viral looked like. But he knew this was more than just attention. This was a spotlight too bright to hide from. Miss Grace reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope. "This came for you this morning. I thought you should open it before the others see." He took it with trembling fingers and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. The letterhead read, "New York Conservatory for Gifted Musicians." The words were short and formal, but the meaning punched through every line. They wanted to meet him. They wanted to hear more. He looked up. "Why me?" Miss Grace smiled, but her voice was serious. "Because you made them feel something they didn't expect to feel, and because they know greatness when they see it." The next few days passed in a surreal blur. Teachers who had never acknowledged him before suddenly found reasons to speak to him, commenting on his discipline, praising his raw artistry, asking if he'd considered applying to elite music academies. Other students hovered nearby, waiting for him to look up, to acknowledge them. Some asked questions, some offered shallow compliments, others simply stared. But not everyone was pleased. Mr. Shelby remained strangely absent. He had not attended classes since the showcase. Rumors swirled that he had taken a short leave of absence to recover from stress, but no one knew for certain. When he finally returned, his demeanor had changed. He was quieter now, his sarcasm dulled, his comments clipped. He made no mention of the performance, no acknowledgement of the viral video, but his eyes, sharp and calculating, watched Jalen with a new kind of intensity. It was not admiration. It was something colder. Jalen felt it, even as his world began to expand. The invitations started arriving, at first 1 or 2, then more. Private music schools inquired about his training. Community organizations asked if he would perform at youth events. A nonprofit for inner-city arts programs offered to sponsor private lessons. But through all of it, Jalen remained cautious. He still practiced every evening in the small closet near the gym, the one with the flickering light and dusty mop in the corner. It was the only space he trusted. The music rooms remained inaccessible. his name mysteriously removed from rehearsal rosters, his requests marked as pending. When he asked the secretary, she shrugged. "Must be an error," she said, eyes drifting back to her computer. His own cello had started showing wear again. The wood was drying in the changing weather, and the strings needed replacing. He mentioned it quietly to one of the junior staff members in the music department, but nothing came of it. And then came the sabotage. It started small. His practice notes disappeared from his locker one afternoon. A few pages from his sketchbook, where he scribbled compositions, were torn and stuffed into a bathroom trash can. Then the cello string snapped mid-practice without warning. He knew it hadn't broken from pressure. He'd checked it that morning. Someone had tampered with it. He told no one. Not because he wasn't angry. He was. Not because he wasn't hurt. He was. But because he had learned, painfully and early, that complaints could be twisted, that victims could be painted as troublemakers, that sometimes the only weapon worth wielding was silence sharpened by consistency. He kept showing up, kept practicing, kept nodding politely to the teachers who'd once ignored him, kept smiling faintly at the classmates who now pretended they had always seen him. He told himself that the music was enough. At home, his grandmother watched him more closely. She didn't ask many questions, but she cooked more than usual, setting plates before him with the quiet insistence of someone who had no armor to offer but care. Sometimes, when she thought he wasn't looking, she would sit near the door while he practiced, hands folded in her lap, listening. On Thursday evening, as he finished playing the last note of a new piece, a quiet, hesitant melody that seemed to echo even after he lifted the bow, she stepped into the room. "You're quieter," she said. "Quieter than usual." Jalen shrugged. "Just tired." She didn't believe him, but she didn't press. Instead, she sat beside him, her knees cracking gently as she lowered herself onto the floor. "When your mama was your age," she said, "she used to come home from the music school crying. Not every day, but enough. Said her teacher told her she wasn't built for the stage, that no one wanted to hear songs from a black girl with calluses on her hands." Jalen looked at her, surprised. She rarely spoke of his mother's school years. "You know what she did?" his grandmother continued. "She wrote her own song, played it every day, played it till that teacher sat in the back of the room and cried." Jalen swallowed hard. "I didn't know that." "There's a reason your cello still sings," she said, resting a hand on his shoulder. "It remembers." He didn't respond, but the warmth of her hand stayed with him long after she left the room. The next day, as he walked the halls of Riverview, the whispers returned, but they were different now. Not cruel, not mocking, just uncertain, curious, and, behind some of them, resentful. Because now, Jalen was a threat, not just a moment, not a novelty, but a presence. And for some, that was unacceptable. By the end of the week, a rumor had begun to spread. Jalen's performance had been a fluke. That he'd only gotten attention because the audience felt sorry for him. That someone else had helped him compose the piece. That maybe it wasn't even his music. He heard it in fragments, in stairwells between lockers, whispered over textbooks. He said nothing. Instead, he walked into the maintenance closet that night, sat down with his cello, and began to write again. Not to prove anything, not to fight shadows, but because in the end, the only truth he had ever needed to speak lived between the notes. And he would keep playing, even if the world tried to silence every chord. It had rained the night before, and by morning, the world outside Riverview Academy was glistening and raw. Damp leaves clung to the sidewalks, the air tasted of wet earth, and a faint chill carried the scent of wood smoke and frost. Within the school, the corridors buzzed with a peculiar stillness, one born not of calm, but of expectancy. Something unspoken was building beneath the surface, a tension that pressed on shoulders and passed in sideways glances. Jalen moved through the halls like a shadow, silent, observant, his cello case slung over his shoulder and his steps light. He had grown used to the stares by now, to the muttered commentary and the wary smiles that never reached the eyes. He had learned to ignore the whispers and the rumors, how his performance had been a fluke, how someone else had written the piece, how he didn't belong. It was all noise. Static he tuned out the way he tuned out the city traffic outside his bedroom window at night. But there were days when the silence grew heavy, when the little cuts of cruelty accumulated until they throbbed under his skin. The small sabotages, vanished sheet music, broken strings, locked practice rooms, had not stopped. They had only become subtler, more targeted. And behind it all, though he had never seen it happen with his own eyes, he felt the hand of Mr. Shelby at work. The teacher had returned to his routines, but not to his former arrogance. His tone was clipped now, polite in the way a snake is polite before it strikes. Every glance he cast toward Jalen felt measured, like he was calculating a debt unpaid. Then came the announcement. It was delivered during Monday's morning assembly in the Great Hall. The headmaster took the stage, his hands folded before him, voice smooth and practiced. Riverview's annual Week of the Arts, he said, would begin in 2 weeks' time. A beloved tradition, a cornerstone of the school's commitment to creative excellence. The best students from the music, visual arts, and theater departments would be selected to showcase their work before visiting donors, university scouts, and representatives from national arts foundations. The announcement was met with enthusiastic applause, murmurs of excitement, and scattered cheers. For most students, this was the event of the year, a chance to shine, to impress, to elevate. For Jalen, it was another kind of test. He didn't expect to be chosen, but he hoped. He hoped because he had earned it, not with legacy or privilege, but with everything else he had: time, talent, soul. He had proved himself on that stage, not for recognition, but for truth. Surely, he thought, they couldn't ignore him now, but they did. When the participant lists were posted on the glass board in the main hall the following week, students gathered around it like pilgrims approaching a shrine. Jalen arrived late. He waited at the back of the crowd, listening to the chatter, watching as names were read aloud with excitement and surprise. He didn't push forward. He waited until the group thinned, until only a few remained. Then he stepped forward. He searched once, then again, then a third time, slower. His name wasn't there. Not under music, not under original composition, not under any category. It was as if he didn't exist. He stared at the board for a long time, his reflection faint in the glass, the list of names hovering like a ghost over his face. There was no explanation, no asterisk, no note about administrative oversight, just absence. A cold knot settled in his chest. Not fury, not disbelief. Just a tired kind of ache, the kind that comes from having expected something better and being punished for it. Behind him, a voice broke the silence. "It's not fair, and we're not going to let it stand." He turned. Miss Grace stood there, arms folded, her jaw tight. She wasn't smiling. Her eyes burned with something fierce and quiet. "I spoke to the board," she said. "There's no justification. They know what you did on that stage. They know what you're capable of, but some people still want you to disappear." Jalen didn't speak. He didn't have to. "Not this time," she said. "We're going to make our own stage." The idea came together like something whispered in secret. It began with a few teachers, Miss Grace, Mr. Rios from history, and Miss Donnelly from theater, who had watched the sabotage unfold in silence for too long. They began to speak in corners, to scribble notes in the margins of lesson plans, to move through the halls with a new sense of purpose. And as they moved, they gathered others. Students who had always felt invisible. Artists whose work didn't fit into neat academic boxes. Musicians who had been overlooked for not playing the right instruments or writing the right kind of music. One by one, they began to join. Not loudly, not rebelliously, quietly, earnestly, like breathing. They called it the real Riverview. The plan was simple. On the same night as the official gala performance, an event of rigid formalities and selected talent, they would hold an alternate concert in the back courtyard, a place long neglected by the school. It would be raw, imperfect, unfiltered. It would be open to anyone who had ever been told they were not enough. They began gathering equipment in secret, old stage lights borrowed from the drama department, fold-out chairs from the dining hall, a microphone that crackled but worked, an upright piano donated to the school years ago and forgotten in a storage room beneath the gym. They found it under a tarp, dusted it off, and tuned it by hand. Jalen watched it all unfold with a cautious kind of hope. He did not lead, he did not speak often, but he played. Every day after school, he returned to the closet where he practiced and poured himself into the new piece he was writing, a composition born not of bitterness, but of clarity. It wasn't angry, it wasn't soft either, it was honest. He called it March of the Unseen, and in it lived every missed opportunity, every quiet act of resilience, every breath he'd taken in defiance of those who expected silence. He didn't tell his grandmother right away. Not until the night before the concert, when he came home and found her mending a loose thread in the sleeve of his shirt. "Tomorrow's the concert," he said softly. She looked up. "The real one?" He smiled. "The real one." She nodded, that was all. Then she patted the seat beside her, and he sat down, letting the sound of her breathing steady his own. The next day passed in a strange haze. The main building bustled with preparations for the official showcase, parents arriving in black cars, floral arrangements placed in marble entryways, teachers rushing through last-minute rehearsals. But in the back courtyard, behind the rows of hedges and beyond the reach of the stage lights, something else was taking shape. The folding chairs were set. The piano had been wheeled into place. The lights flickered but held. Someone had strung fairy lights between the trees, and their soft glow turned the space into something magical. Students arrived in waves, some in full uniform, some in jeans and jackets, all carrying instruments, scripts, paintings. It was not polished, it was not rehearsed, but it was real. And just before sunset, Jalen arrived. He wore the same shirt he had worn the night of the original showcase. Clean but simple. His shoes were scuffed. A cello was strapped to his back. He stepped onto the small wooden platform and looked out at the crowd. It wasn't large. 50 people, maybe more. A few teachers, a few parents, students he had never spoken to. Miss Grace stood at the edge of the stage, her arms folded, her face calm. Mr. Rios adjusted the lights. Miss Donnelly handed out cups of tea. He sat. The cello creaked beneath him. The wind stirred the leaves. And for a moment, the world stood still. Then he began to play. The opening notes of March of the Unseen fell like raindrops, delicate, deliberate, precise. The melody climbed and turned, weaving through chords of tension and resolve. It did not shout. It did not plead. It told the truth. And as he played, the courtyard changed. People leaned forward. Some closed their eyes. A girl in the second row began to cry. Even the wind seemed to still. And in the distance, behind the high windows of the auditorium, the music leaked through the cracks. Some students paused mid-performance. Some turned their heads. In the far shadows, Mr. Shelby stood rigid, watching from behind a curtain. His face was pale, his fists clenched, because he knew. The real concert wasn't happening on the polished stage with chandeliers and carefully curated applause. It was here, in the back courtyard, on creaking wood, under the stars, and no one could stop it. The courtyard had never seen a night like this. It had always been the forgotten part of Riverview Academy, a place used for storage deliveries and emergency fire drills, its flagstone tiles chipped, the grass between them left to grow wild and uneven. It was where students went to sneak a moment of solitude, to cry without being seen, to call home from a corner where no one could hear. No one had ever imagined it could become a stage. But on this night, under a sky so clear it looked like it had been scrubbed clean, the courtyard pulsed with something sacred. At 6 o'clock sharp, as the last orange of sunset slipped behind the roof line, the concert began. Jalen stood at the edge of the platform, he would not call it a stage, and looked out over the gathered faces. There were no velvet curtains, no assigned seats, no spotlights. The only illumination came from the fairy lights strung between the skeletal branches of the bare trees, and the quiet flicker of battery-powered lanterns placed at the feet of each chair. There was no usher, no program, no fanfare. There was only music waiting to be played. He had not spoken since he arrived. He had greeted no one. Not because he was afraid or because he wanted to remain mysterious, but because there was nothing left to say. Everything he needed to express lived in the melody that had been churning in his chest for weeks, begging to be released. All he had to do now was let it out. He adjusted the cello against his knees, tightened the bow with steady fingers, and closed his eyes. The opening notes were barely audible, delicate as breath. The courtyard leaned in. Even the night air stilled as the first bars of March of the Unseen took shape, blooming slowly into sound. He had composed it with no structure in mind, only emotion. It had no lyrics, but it spoke volumes. In every stroke of the bow, there were years of silence. In every shift of tone, every swell and dip, there were hallways walked alone, names whispered behind hands, doors that had closed before he ever reached them. The music climbed like a story, not loud but unrelenting. It gathered momentum as it rose, layering rhythms that mimicked the steady beat of a heart that refuses to stop, even when it's tired. His fingers moved with precision, not as a performer pleasing a crowd, but as someone delivering a message that could not wait another moment. And the people listened. In the front row, Miss Grace sat motionless, her face unreadable, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Beside her, Mr. Rios stared forward, eyes glassy. Students who had never spoken to Jalen before leaned forward in their seats, transfixed. Parents who had come simply to humor their children now found themselves gripping the edges of their chairs. The piece was not perfect. A note rang flat near the middle. His wrist trembled once when he reached the final section, but none of that mattered. What mattered was the truth. The music didn't beg for pity. It didn't scream in protest. It simply existed. And in doing so, it broke something open. When the last note hovered in the air, there was no immediate applause. No one moved, no one breathed. The silence was complete, reverent, It was the kind of silence that came after something holy. Then, from the far corner of the courtyard, someone clapped. Once, then again. Then another joined, and another. And suddenly, the small makeshift concert exploded in sound, not of music, but of joy. Applause, real and wild, rippled through the crowd like a storm breaking over a dry field. Jalen remained seated, his chest rising and falling in slow, even rhythm. He did not bow. He did not smile. He simply looked out at them all, the glow of the lanterns catching in his eyes, and finally allowed himself a breath. They had heard him, but the night was far from over. As the concert continued one after another, students took the stage, poets with voices trembling and defiant, dancers who performed barefoot, painters who held their canvases aloft in shaken hands. It was a cascade of voices long silenced, now crashing forward all at once. The courtyard became more than a venue. It became a reckoning, and beyond the hedges, inside the gleaming auditorium at the heart of Riverview, the official gala continued. There, under chandeliers and orchestral suites, the polished performances played out exactly as rehearsed, every note on time, every costume immaculate. But something was off. The audience sensed it. There were missing students, a restlessness among the younger performers, a tension in the air, and then someone opened the side doors. At first it was just a trickle, a parent who had heard whispers of the real concert, a student who had snuck away between acts. Then more came, drawn not by rebellion, but by something magnetic. The sounds of music that was imperfect and alive, of voices unfiltered, of something real. Soon, the back rows of the auditorium were emptying. Even teachers began slipping out, murmuring excuses about fresh air. No one tried to stop them. No one had to. They weren't abandoning the gala. They were running toward the truth. Among those who remained was Mr. Shelby. He stood in the wings, arms folded, jaw clenched. His eyes were fixed on the glowing courtyard in the distance. From his vantage point, he could see the tops of the crowd's heads, the sway of shadows dancing under the trees, the blur of a cello bow carving air. He had spent years building a system where only the right kind of excellence was rewarded. Controlled, cultivated, correct. What he saw now was chaos, unruly, unedited, uncontainable. And it terrified him. He made no move to follow. He stood still as stone while the hall emptied. By the time the final act of the official concert took the stage, fewer than a third of the seats were filled. In the courtyard, it was standing room only. When the final performer bowed and stepped back into the crowd, Miss Grace took the stage. She said nothing at first. Then, raising her voice just enough to be heard over the wind, she thanked everyone for showing up, not just to the concert, but to something more important: each other. "We are not here because someone invited us," she said. "We are here because we deserve to be heard." The crowd erupted again. Jalen stood at the edge of the gathering, cello case strapped once more to his back, his fingers still aching from the performance. He said little to anyone. A few students approached him, some to offer praise, others simply to stand beside him in quiet solidarity. He received them all with calm. Gratitude, yes, but no need for celebration, because this had never been about winning. As the courtyard began to empty, he found himself walking beside Miss Grace, who carried a stack of folding chairs in her arms and hummed softly under her breath. "They'll talk about this night," she said. Jalen looked up at her. "Do you think it'll change anything?" She paused, then gave a small, tired smile. "Change doesn't always come in storms. Sometimes it's a note held just long enough for someone to realize it means something." They walked in silence after that, Across campus, the official concert had ended. The headmaster stood at the podium, thanking donors and shaking hands, his smile brittle. The auditorium was half empty. The press had left early, and in the shadows behind the theater, Mr. Shelby stood alone, watching as Jalen disappeared into the dark. He had tried to control the story. He had tried to write Jalen out of it. But now the story belonged to someone else. And no matter how loudly the school tried to sing its rehearsed songs, the world would always remember the night it fell silent. The Monday after the concert was unlike any other morning in Riverview Academy's recent memory. The air was still sharp with the crispness of late autumn, but something else hung in the halls, an unspoken awareness that a threshold had been crossed. The walls of tradition that had once seemed impenetrable now felt brittle, and everywhere students walked with a heightened sense of alertness, as if aware they were living inside the pause between a tremor and a collapse. Jalen arrived at school the same way he always had, quiet and early, his cello strapped securely across his back. But this time, he wasn't invisible. The moment he stepped through the gates, eyes followed him, not with mockery, not with pity, but with a new tentative kind of respect. It wasn't fanfare. No one clapped. No one threw open their arms. But they saw him now. They moved out of his way, not out of fear, but recognition. In the classrooms, conversations shifted. In hallways, whispers gave way to questions. Students who had once laughed behind his back now lowered their voices when he passed. Some greeted him with cautious smiles, as if afraid their past behavior might still hang in the air. Others nodded simply, as though acknowledging not just a performance, but a truth they could no longer deny. The administration, on the other hand, said nothing. The headmaster issued no statement, made no mention of the unofficial concert. The school's official newsletter published a glowing summary of the sanctioned showcase, naming students who had dazzled with their precision and poise, but Jalen's name was absent. So were the names of the dozens of students and teachers who had participated in the courtyard concert, as if it had never happened, but it had. And the silence only made it louder. Within days, murmurs reached the school board. Some parents, moved by what they'd witnessed in the courtyard, began to call for recognition, not just for Jalen, but for all the students who had been excluded. A few wrote letters, others demanded meetings. Photos began circulating online, showing the courtyard filled with lanterns and students huddled around a rickety stage. One parent posted a video with the caption, "This was the real Riverview." The administration scrambled to respond, but they were too late. A fire had been lit, and it burned with slow, deliberate certainty. Mr. Shelby, meanwhile, moved through the school like a man drowning in shallow water. He tried to maintain his routines, lectures delivered with forced calm, corrections spoken in clipped tones, but the weight of the shift in atmosphere pressed against him. His authority, once unquestioned, now felt hollow. Students no longer laughed at his sarcasm. Some openly challenged his remarks. Others simply tuned him out. He tried to reclaim his grip on the narrative. He called a private meeting with the headmaster. He presented documents, quotes from the handbook, performance rubrics, lists of approved instruments and styles. He argued that the courtyard concert had violated school protocol, that those who had participated should face disciplinary action. But the headmaster, wary and embattled, hesitated. The board was already watching. The press had caught wind of the story, and the last thing anyone wanted now was a scandal. Still, a plan was set into motion. That Thursday, an email was sent to several students and teachers, a summons to appear before the school's disciplinary committee. The charges were vague: unauthorized use of school property, disruption of campus events, violation of performance guidelines. Among those named were Jalen, Miss Grace, Mr. Rios, and 8 other students who had performed or assisted at the courtyard concert. The message was meant to be quiet, but by lunchtime it was everywhere. The students named in the summons met in the library after school. They didn't speak much. They didn't have to. They all knew what was happening. This wasn't just about rules. It was about control. The concert had embarrassed the administration, and now someone wanted to make an example. That night, Miss Grace drafted a letter. It was not angry. It was not emotional. It was clear, direct, and unflinching. It outlined the events leading up to the courtyard concert, the exclusion from the Week of the Arts, the sabotage, the systemic dismissal of certain students' talent. It challenged the legitimacy of the disciplinary actions and demanded transparency. Then she shared it with the others, and they all signed. The next morning, copies of the letter appeared on every classroom door. By noon, parents were forwarding it to school board members. By evening, a scanned version had made its way to a national education blog. On Friday, the headmaster called an emergency assembly. The auditorium was packed, but the air was tense. Students sat with crossed arms. Teachers watched with guarded expressions. When the headmaster stepped onto the stage, he looked paler than usual, his voice less confident. He began with a speech about tradition, about discipline, about maintaining the values of Riverview Academy. He spoke of order, of decorum. But when he attempted to explain the purpose of the disciplinary proceedings, the room shifted. A student in the 3rd row stood, then another, then a teacher, and suddenly half the room was on its feet, silent but unyielding. They weren't shouting, they weren't chanting, they simply stood, like trees refusing to bow in the wind. The headmaster faltered. His words trailed off. Then, from the back of the room, someone walked to the front. Jalen. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't wait for a microphone. He stepped onto the stage and turned to face the audience. Cello was not with him. He brought no script. He just stood there. "I didn't ask to be invited," he said, his voice steady. "I only wanted to play." The room held its breath. I didn't ask for attention. I didn't want praise. But when I was told I didn't belong, when my name was left off that list, I realized something. I realized the people writing those lists didn't know me, and they didn't care to. A murmur rippled through the crowd. "So I played anyway," Jalen continued. "And not just for me. For everyone who's ever been made to feel invisible. For everyone who's ever been told they're not the right kind of talent, the right kind of student, the right kind of person." He paused, then added, "You don't get to erase that." Silence again. Not awkward, not uncertain, powerful. The board responded within days. An independent inquiry was launched. Students and teachers were interviewed. Evidence was reviewed. Emails surfaced. Correspondence between Mr. Shelby and administrative staff suggesting intentional exclusion. Accounts of tampered instruments, lost sheet music, locked practice rooms. And then came the decision. Mr. Shelby was dismissed. The headmaster was placed on administrative leave pending further review, and the courtyard concert was officially recognized as a legitimate school event. New policies were implemented. The selection process for showcases was restructured. The arts curriculum expanded to include non-traditional forms of expression. A fund was created to support students from underrepresented backgrounds, and Jalen was invited, formally this time, to perform at the city's Youth Arts Gala. He declined. Instead, he suggested a group performance. a medley composed by several students, featuring musicians from the courtyard concert to be performed on the school's front lawn, open to the public. It was accepted. On the night of the performance, Jalen stood beneath the school's flagpole, cello in hand, and played alongside classmates who had once been strangers and teachers who had once felt powerless. The lawn was packed with parents, community members, former alumni. Cameras rolled, but Jalen didn't care. He wasn't playing for them. He was playing for his mother, who had once told him his music would speak when his voice couldn't. For his grandmother, who sat in the front row with tears in her eyes and a blanket over her lap. For every note played in the dark, every practice held in closets and borrowed spaces. He played because now the sound could no longer be silenced. And Riverview Academy listened. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Watch our next videos for even more powerful stories, and share this one with someone who needs to hear it.